The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host with the most, Ian Kahanowitz. And if you live in the Northeast or you live in Canada like my guest today, Brian Martin, who returns to the show to talk classic baseball, we're talking about, classic Detroit baseball. We're going to talk about the Detroit Wolverines, the rise and wreck of a National League champion, 1881 to 1888. We learned a lot of fantastic things, but even before we get that, the weather has been awful. Okay, in Boston the other day, it snowed about 5 inches, and then it was all gone by the afternoon. It's cold, it's rainy. It showed in Yankee Stadium yesterday as I was watching the game with the Tampa Bay Rays, the mist, the breath. It was just horrible baseball conditions, and it shows with some of these teams like Detroit. They're on a 1-4 start. Pittsburgh has been uncannily good. The Yankees are having problems. The Red Sox, for some reason, because they've been playing in the South, they're on a 5-game winning streak. But, there's a lot of baseball for the 2018 coming up, and I'm all excited that baseball has started because I waited all winter for this. And now that it's here, the show picks up a little bit in listeners. My websites, all of them, every day I get anywhere from 10 to 20 people who want to join. Ty Cobb in the dead ball era, the Negro Leagues, my broadcasting, the New York Yankees won, the Dodger won, the women won. I mean, I'm getting people like Ray Knight. Now, if you remember Ray Knight from the 1986 World Series, he was the guy who scored when Buckner actually bobbled the ball. He sent me a friend request. I spoke to him, and he's me and him. I said, I never thought I'd be speaking to you 30-something years later, but, I speak to a lot of them. Brett Boone, Kent Merker, all these wonderful guys, and Fritz Peterson, who's a little bit sick these days, Mickey Rivers, but hey, it's what it is. You go onto Facebook, you become, semi-decent. I don't think I'm good. But anyway, you become semi-decent. People know. So they come, and we're having a great time. And I'm telling you, we're going to break the station identification because I'm on it, always on it to be with Ralph Tycho and the Zigzag, man, on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And let me tell you, folks, you got top-notch entertainment here. You got Peter Golenbach, you got Hal Bach, you got so many good, authors and folks who had announced in baseball and have done baseball. We got Bill Kashanis, he's out in Philadelphia. We got David Finoli, he's out in Pittsburgh. You got me screaming the head off in Boston, being a Yankee fan. So much good stuff. Continue listening to the network. It's continuing to grow. Brings us to shows like this. We're talking about the Detroit Wolverines today, and hey, it's always an honor to have Brian Chip Martin on. And I'll tell you why. He was an award-winning journalist, and he's up there in Canada. I'm going to ask him how it's up there, and he's a member of the selection committee of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. And, of course, Sabre. And when you have journalists on the show, people who do their homework, people who create books like this, and we've had Chip on his other books, and this one takes the cake as well. Awesome book. Before I even bring Chip out, this is a book you want to get for your archives. The Detroit Wolverines, The Rise and Wreck of a National League Champion, 1881, 1888. We're going to go through some of the highlights of the book. Great stuff. Great baseball history. Without any ado, welcome to the show, Chip.
Thank you, Ian. I'm delighted to be back.
Now, why the Detroit Wolverines, and how long did it take you to do the research? Because your nose is everywhere, including the Detroit Public Library.
Well, yeah, I've spent some quality time in the Detroit Public Library, at the Detroit Historical Society. I spent an inordinate amount of time going through the archives of the Detroit Free Press. When you're working on something, there's it's just a matter of digging and persisting and sticking with it. And I'm like as a former newspaper reporter, I'm a bit of like a dog with a pork chop. I'm chasing it and going after it, and I don't rest until I find what I'm looking for.
Well, you know what? You did a fantastic job here. Well, let me ask you, how is Detroit like post-Civil War? And why Detroit was so eager to get a baseball team to begin with? Let's start with that story.
Okay, well, by the 1870s or so, Detroit was reaching this about 100,000 population, and it was becoming an industrial city. Henry Ford was still dinkering around with back on the farm in Dearborn in the 1880s, 1890s, and up to 1900 more or less. So the city wasn't the Motor City yet, but it was becoming a very prosperous city. It had a variety of industries. There were paints and solvents and chemicals and railway car wheels. They got a contract from the North in the Civil War to build railway cars, and that was a big business for them. It was a very leafy city. It was beautifully laid out. It had some fine public buildings, lovely boulevards and thoroughfares, a lot of nice private homes. It was known as the Paris of the West, believe it or not. And it was a destination for tour boats on the Great Lakes, and people talked about Detroit as quite a lovely city. And its transformation into the Motor City was still years in the future, but back then there was a movement afoot. It wasn't as large as, say, Chicago and New York and Boston and some of the other major cities in the States, but they had a new mayor that came in 1881, or 1880 actually, elected in late 1880. He wanted to have a baseball team. He thought, Detroit's in the big leagues of the American cities, and this baseball thing looks pretty good, and I've got a bunch of capitalist friends. The mayor had married into a couple of very wealthy families, was well connected. He was a lawyer, and he'd been in the Civil War, and he decided it was time that Detroit should play in the big league. So he applied, as the new mayor of Detroit, he applied on letterhead of the office of the mayor of the city of Detroit for a franchise in the National League. And in fact, he got it. Cincinnati was bumped out and was replaced. Detroit replaced them in the National League, and he actually ran the team out of the mayor's office for the first 3 or 4 years. As sort of a civic function, having a big league baseball team. Interesting times.
And you know what's funny? Again, we're dealing with the Midwest over here, and even you point out in your chapter over here, I could say that the Detroit baseball started from all places across the border in Ohio. You got Mr. Bill Hollinger over there, and really the first cracks at Detroit baseball took place from Cleveland and Cincinnati. Let's discuss this.
Okay, well, the Cleveland team, I think it was called the Four Cities, and they were a little ahead of Detroit in terms of getting a professional baseball. For quite a while in Detroit, playing professional baseball was considered beneath the dignity of people. It was sort of still a gentleman's sport, and there was sort of a Victorian mentality that real people don't play baseball. It's just for children or for roustabouts, that sort of thing. Well, there's a team in Cleveland, and the manager of that team came to Detroit at one point. His name was Bill Hollinger, and he came to Detroit looking for players for his Cleveland team for the National League. And he while he's away in Detroit signing up players, his back in Cleveland cuts them loose and basically fires them. So Bill Hollinger is here on a recruiting mission in Detroit. And he's been there for a while and seeing what's available and what sort of talent is available, and discovers that there's this new place called Recreation Park that's being built. It's a harness racing facility, but also cricket pitch, baseball diamond, a swimming pool, all sorts of things for people that are starting to get some leisure time. And he falls in with these people that are connected with the mayor, and they say, well, yeah, if you want to do a baseball team here, here's where you can play. And so he decided, well, they cut me loose in Cleveland. I'm going to start up the first professional baseball team in Detroit, which he did. Now, it was unaffiliated. It wasn't in any league. So they played for several months, but were having difficulty getting competition. They played in Michigan and in Ontario a bit, and they would play touring teams that came by. But for the most part, they were unable to find much competition. Therefore, they were unable to meet the payroll. so by late July, I think it was, they had to fold. But that was the very first professional baseball team in Detroit in 1879. And for 1880, there was no team. But by 1881, the mayor that I talked about earlier decided, let's get back into baseball. And we're a big league city, and even though they were smaller than a lot of the other centers, they certainly weren't as small as places like Troy and Syracuse and Providence and Hartford and Worcester and a number of those places that had already been in the National League or were going to be in the National League. So it wasn't the smallest, but they were smaller, and there was an issue over the period of time. There was an issue with respect to getting a good foothold in Detroit baseball, getting bums in the seats in the ballpark. But we can talk about that.
Recreation Park was their home. Let's talk about Recreation Park. Very important part of Detroit's history here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Recreation Park was a bunch of the wealthy people in Detroit realized that, we could make some money off recreation, harness racing, cricket, providing people a place to go on a Sunday, which was really the only day of rest. And a bunch of them got together and with their money, and they developed this beautiful facility on the north edge of the Brush Farm, which was, if you know Detroit, the Renaissance Center is on the southern flank of what was the Brush Farm, and on the northern edge of it, they installed Recreation Park. Spent a fair bit of money on it, and the baseball diamond was in the middle of the harness racing course. The track itself was in play. If somebody was playing baseball in there, the outfielder had to go back and chase the ball back, would have to cross the track. Hopefully nobody was riding a horse by or any horse race going on at the time, but it was notwithstanding that sort of odd layout. I know in Brooklyn they had the Fashion course back in, I think, 1858. When baseball was becoming professional, they needed a facility where you could actually restrict admission and charge entry, so they used the Fashion course raceway in Brooklyn in order to be able to control admission and make money from baseball. Well, so it wasn't unusual to do this sort of thing because you were able to control the entrance. The baseball diamond was visited by a number of people like Harry Wright and some of the major players of the time. And back when the Detroit Wolverines were in operation a few years later, pronounced it one of the most beautiful ballparks in all of North America. And they spent an awful lot of money making it attractive. And despite the horses racing around the outside, sometimes they talked about the women in finery coming to the ball diamond to watch baseball. And there were people racing horses around, and they were kicking up the dust, and the ladies in the finery were not very happy with getting dust all over their clothing. Horses kick up even more dust than baseball players, of course.
And, the interesting thing about Recreation Park was after the Wolverines, folded in the season after in 1888, like you mentioned, there's a big parallel to the Polo Grounds. And again, today, what exists there is Harper Hospital. There's new buildings there. I think Detroit Medical Center.
Yeah, the Detroit Medical Center campus is quite large, and right in the middle of it, between the Children's Hospital and the Women's Hospital, there's sort of a little parquet, and all that's there is a little historical plaque saying this is where the outfield of Recreation Park was. The team folded after the 1888 season. In 1894, they plowed under the park and put in housing. So all that's left of the earliest professional ball team and where they played in Detroit is just a plaque. That's basically all that's left behind.
Now let me ask you about Mr. Thompson over here. Didn't he fight in the Civil War and? Wasn't he a war veteran? And when he became
he was William Thompson, who became the mayor. William G. Thompson, who became the mayor at the end of 1880, had been in the Civil War. I think he was originally from Ohio, if I recall correctly.
Pennsylvania. I think he was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Lancaster, that's it. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. That's quite right. And you've read it more recently than I wrote it, obviously.
That's right.
And anyway, he was posted at one point to Detroit during the Civil War, and became a lawyer, and decided after the war to go. He was injured, wounded, and after the war he decided to set up practice as a lawyer in Detroit. And he married into the Brush family. I mentioned Brush Farm; they were among the early settlers. He also married into another prominent family, and that was his first wife died. And so basically he was extremely well connected for an outsider. All the major capitalists and the movers and shakers of Detroit, he was part of them, and actually eventually became their candidate for mayor as a Republican. And that's how he became the mayor for a couple of terms in the early 1800s. But he was the one that really, as an adopted Detroiter, was the one that really wanted to put Detroit on the map and said, we can do that with professional baseball. It's something that's new out there. We should get in on it, and we can be a big league city too.
And you know, it's funny because with Detroit, I always say today, if Detroit's going to clean up the city, they're going to need help and infrastructure from the outside, because basically there are, as you well know, there are so many vacated parts of the city. They literally have to shorten the city because they had like 2 million occupants in 1950, and now I think it's like 750,000.
Yep. Those numbers are exactly right. Detroit has the city, the central part of the city has withered and died. And of course, it's unlike Boston or New York or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or any other city in that Detroit is built on very, very flat land. And aside from the Detroit River, which separates Detroit from Canada, it's extremely flat, the land around Detroit, and it's very, very easy for the city to sprawl outward. And it really took off after the riots of 1967. And the suburbia goes forever. I live 2 hours away from it. I'm down there a fair bit. And I can attest to the fact that you can go for miles upon miles upon miles and see the same thing spreading out. It's not constrained by mountains or by shoreline or other impediments like that. It's sprawl city. And what has happened is the central part of the city has withered down to about 750,000, and as you know, it went bankrupt just a few years ago. It's now getting back on its feet, and quite frankly, there's a real renaissance going on in downtown Detroit now. There's the guy from Quicken Loans, Dan Gilbert, owns over 100 properties down there, and they're rebuilding and repurposing and building all sorts of new, exciting businesses down there. You've got the Little Caesars Arena, you've got Comerica Park, which is fairly new, Ford Field, which is fairly new, the old Hudson's Department Store, which was an iconic fixture of downtown Detroit and which was leveled in 1998, I think it was. They've just come up with a plan for an 800-foot huge high-rise building on that property. There's all sorts of stuff that's starting to happen in downtown Detroit, but I think it's starting to happen now because the land values became so low because the city became so depressed. There's lots of vacant lots, lots of underused properties, and in fact, Detroit's starting to see a real boom. And recently there have been stories in a number of significant publications talking about Detroit as comeback city. Now, as I point out in my book, the Packard plant and the American Motors plant and a number of those are vacant and they're trying to repurpose them. But there's a long way to go. But there's signs that things are improving. And while it's not going to be called the Paris of the West anymore like it was back at the time of the Wolverines, I think a lot of the image that Detroit has accumulated over the last few years, I think some of that's going to start changing.
Hey, when we talk about getting, things into Detroit now, that's how baseball started in Detroit, as you well pointed out. Thompson went over to Hilbert, who I think was in Chicago at the time, and lobbied for a team to be chartered.
Yep. And the timing was perfect because they were just kicking out Cincinnati because Cincinnati was allowing the sale of alcohol in the ballpark and Sunday games in its ballpark, and Cincinnati was the bad boy of the National League. So basically the National League was about to evict them, and Cincinnati says, well, heck with you, we're just going to quit. And they left the league, and they were among the founders of the American Association in 1882. And that created an instant opening for Detroit, and because it was reasonably close to Chicago and Cleveland and some of the other cities that were, it would be easy to incorporate it into the loop. So his timing was perfect, Thompson, with respect to applying for the National League, and the National League really wanted to send a message to Cincinnati and bring in a more compliant team, and that's what Detroit wound up being over its history was quite tied in with the Halbert and Spalding and some of the other big mucky mucks in the National League. They threatened to leave at one point, but I think that was just a bluff. But anyway, Detroit became a much more compliant member of the league than Cincinnati had been.
Now, you had the Worcester, Massachusetts teams playing in Detroit prior to the establishment of the Wolverines. And again, you're coming, an outsider's coming in. We can't even think of what the Wolverines would be like without the talk of Frank Bancroft. The first
absolutely. Absolutely. Frank Bancroft was one of the most successful early managers of ball teams. I think it was the Worcester Ruby Legs. I think that was the name of the team in Worcester. And he was very successful with them. And then when Detroit started up, they hired him as their first manager. Bancroft, among other things, I mean, he was in baseball for 50-something years. He was a hotel manager. I think he did some stage productions. But he got around baseball quite a bit, was quite successful. He's credited, I believe, as I recall, with being one of the first to come up with spring training in the South. He did reasonably well. Detroit finished, I think, fourth or something the first year out. He was around for 2 years, and then he left and moved on. But he was one of the reasons that Detroit started off reasonably well. This guy was quite knowledgeable, and in the course of baseball history, he's considered one of the early bright lights.
And you know what's interesting about him? He did stay in baseball for about 50 years, and
more than 50 years. Yeah.
And when he left in 1882, he went to Providence, which is 10 minutes from my house, and he won the championship in the 1884 World Series with the Grays.
Oh yeah, no, he was a terrific. I think he's really an underappreciated player person from the early days of baseball. He was smart, and he was able to juggle the career as running a hotel. He held on to that. It was at New Bedford or somewhere he had it.
Yep.
And he had that for a long time. And he also had touring stage shows, and he was a very, very busy man. I don't know how he juggled all the balls and kept them all in the air so successfully.
And you know what's interesting with Bancroft? He took some of his Worcester players, and he recruited them. One of them, his first one was catcher Charlie Bennett. Let's talk about Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie Bennett. Charlie Bennett was the first baseball star in Detroit. He was from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, just north of Pittsburgh, and he was playing with some of the local teams in the Detroit area. The Etnas, I think, was one of them. And Bancroft had him playing for him in Worcester, as I recall, and brought, I think, Bennett and 2 or 3 other players from Worcester with him to Detroit for the first season. Charlie Bennett was one of 2 players that was with the Wolverines for its entire run. And he was a good-looking guy. He was an excellent catcher. Why he's not in the Hall of Fame, I do not know. But he was a rock behind the plate for the Wolverines, and a pretty good bat as well. He because he was so handsome, visiting teams that they visited in the newspapers would say, "Oh, ladies, the Detroit Wolverines and Charlie Bennett are coming to town." He was a bit of an attraction. They loved him. The fans loved him in Detroit. And after he left Detroit, he was playing in Boston. And in 1894, I think it was, he was out on a hunting trip somewhere in Kansas, and he ran for a train that he was late for, and he fell beneath the wheels, and he lost both of his legs, and retired to Detroit. And for every year from 94, I guess it was, up till he died in 1926, he threw out the first pitch at the baseball park in Detroit, which for quite a while was known as Bennett Park. He was a loved character in terms of early days baseball, and as I said, he was only one of 2 players that was with the Wolverines for its entire history from 1881 to 1888.
And the other player who you're talking about is Ned Hanlon, and I can't begin to tell you how important Ned Hanlon was, because without Ned Hanlon, you wouldn't have a Casey Stengel, you wouldn't have a John McGraw. Ned Hanlon's influence on managing and baseball strategy, I always said, lasted probably about 100 years, because Billy Martin, I think, was probably the last of the managers to employ Hanlon's tactics. Because again, He was trained by Casey. He was trained by McGraw. He was trained by Hanlon. Let's talk about that over here.
He was very, very aggressive, small ball, base stealing, bunting, all sorts of things. He would do anything to get a man on base and then to advance them around. He was very, very aggressive, and he brought an entirely new style of managing to baseball. And he was around for a long, 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 long time. I mean, I'm researching now about Baltimore for my next book, and he was involved in Baltimore with the Federal League team. He was involved with the Orioles as an owner. I mean, he was around baseball, and his footprint on the game is absolutely massive. And he was the captain. He was the captain of the Wolverines, and was along with Charlie Bennett, was a large reason for that the team was as successful as it was. Hanlon is an amazing individual, terrific, both as a player but as a manager and later as an owner.
You know, you're writing about Baltimore. Is that like the Baltimore teams in the 1890s?
No, I'm writing about the fellow that taught Babe Ruth how to play baseball.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, they became the New York Yankees. A lot of people don't know that, you know. A lot of people don't know that because I'll tell you, they were sold after the 1902 season. Became the Highlanders, and the Highlanders became the Yankees, the Orioles. Yeah, you know, and that's when John McGraw went to the Giants.
Yeah, but the guy I'm writing about is Brother Matthias from St. Mary's Industrial Training School, and believe it or not, he was a Canadian.
They never wrote a book about Brother Matthias?
Yes, I'm doing a book on Brother Matthias.
But no one ever wrote a book on him?
Nope.
How do you like that? He's the guy that...
taught Babe Ruth. Yeah, he taught Babe Ruth how to play baseball, and I like the irony of the fact that he was born in Cape Breton Island. He was a Canadian.
Oh, my God. And it was never... And how the hell did he get down to Maryland?
Well, his family moved to Halifax after his father was working in the coal mining industry on Cape Breton Island. Family moved to Halifax 3 or 4 years after he was born. They looked around there, didn't like the prospects too great. Halifax was in a bit of a depression. They moved down to Boston, and they resettled in Boston. And he eventually linked up with the Xaverian Brotherhood and became a Xaverian brother. He was trained in Louisville and Baltimore, and in 1898 or 9, he was posted to St. Mary's Industrial Training School, and in 1902, a 7-year-old boy named George Ruth was committed to St. Mary's Industrial Training School as an incorrigible boy. And Brother Matthias took him under his wing, taught him how to play baseball.
And when is this book going to come out? How far along are you in it, Chip?
Oh, I'm almost halfway through it. It's going to be next year anyway before it can come out. I've been busy talking about Detroit.
Yeah.
and other things, yeah.
You know, something you're like me. You're going to be putting out a book a year. It's wonderful, you know.
Oh, it keeps Ian, I don't know about you, but it keeps me out of trouble, and I love doing it. I don't make much money, but I sure love talking about it. I love the research, and I love learning about the various aspects of baseball, the great American and Canadian game.
And you know what I always say, when you start a book, and I don't know how you did it for the Wolverines and your other projects, but when I start a book, I get rid of all preconceived notions that I ever had on my subject. And I let the information that I uncover, like a detective or a lawyer, like I am, tell me the story. And that's all I do. I lay it out in my book, and I quote and I cite wherever I got the information saying.
Exactly. You've got to start with a blank slate, and you have to find out everything that's ever been written about or been researched about the subject matter, and then go where the evidence takes you, go where the story takes you. But my problem was not so much with the Wolverines, because there's never a book about the Wolverines written before, but there's been over 24 written about Babe Ruth, and working on the one about the guy who taught Babe how to play baseball. A number of the historians and writers have said there's so much mist and fog and invention and legend surrounding Babe Ruth. Separating the wheat from the chaff is really, really tough. However, I was very fortunate with the Wolverines. There were some excellent books that took me up to right before the Wolverines came into existence, and then with the Tigers that followed them, several books have been written about them. So I basically had the field to myself on the Wolverines, and a lot of people in Detroit told me they'd always heard a little something about the Wolverines, and nobody could understand why there'd never been a book about them. And as I got into it, I went, this is a terrific story. How come there's never been a book about them? And so that's how I got to where I am.
And, of course, you publish with McFarland. McFarland will be picking up your next manuscript?
Absolutely. Got a contract.
Oh, good for you. Yeah.
I don't write unless I've got something at the end of the tunnel that isn't the light of the train coming at me. I've got the contract and love doing it. They seem to like what I do. The Wolverines is my fourth baseball book with them, and they're comfortable with me. I'm comfortable with them, and Bob's your uncle.
Yeah, I ended up, I love talking about creating the book, and not just talking about it, because no one knows unless you actually write a book, especially on nonfiction like we do.
Mm-hmm.
The amount, every time I'm doing my manuscript, I got to stop, put a footnote in, and then lay it out, and you can't even index it until they start the editing process.
Well, you can't index it until they have the page proofs, and that's way down at the end of the process. And creating an index, Ian, as you may well know, is one heck of a job and thankless and very tedious, and it's the worst part of doing a book. I don't mind the footnotes, and I don't mind entering all the details about where I got the information from and the writing. I was a journalist for 41 years, so the writing isn't hard. I love the research. It's the tedious aspect of putting together an index. That, to me, and the interesting thing is, a lot of people, when they're thinking about, should I buy this book or not, they turn to the index because they want to know what is my guy covered, or is my Uncle Frank covered, or did they get into that aspect? So it's a very important thing to do, because sometimes the final decision about whether I'm going to buy this book is based on what they find in the index.
Yeah, and that's what I do too. I go on, and you know what I do? This is what I do. I buy all the books on Amazon that are secondhand used copies.
You do exactly the same thing I do. Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
They're in great.
And some of them are from old libraries and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. So I'll pay $3 for the book with free shipping.
Yeah. And of course we're all also really angry when people are doing that to buy our books and they're not buying them either from us or from our publisher, right? I hate to think of our books as remainders that people are picking up for $1.50.
Yeah, but something.
Yeah.
It still gets the word out there, and if they can't get a copy of it, they'll go to Amazon. What I was told how to market the book is I'm not just going to rely. 50,000 people follow me, so I say my shows generate between 5,000 and 7,000 viewers, listeners with every show. And that's like 10% of the people follow me. But I put out something the other day that my book's coming out, and you had about 400 people say, I can't wait to see this book. You've done it.
Oh, good for you.
So, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my show on the road. I'm not going to go to stadiums. That doesn't work. I'm going to go to the local areas around here, my library, the thing there. You do your roundtable discussion. You bring a bunch of books with you. You go to the Knights of Columbus or whatever local legion there is near you. You put an ad in the paper, and then people that are going to show up are going to buy the book.
Now, there's something I do. I do all that stuff, but I do one other thing that I don't know whether you do or not. I go on podcasts.
Yeah, like me. Yeah. So that's the thing.
Yeah, but do you go on other podcasts?
Well, something. I've been invited to many podcasts.
Yeah.
I don't go to the podcast, but I go to Sports Bio in America, where I'm usually on, or I go to Detroit, and they get me on the radio, or I go to the local Boston station here, the sports station here.
I got on in Detroit. I got on WJR, which is a super station there. I had 9 minutes on the morning show there one day. That was awesome. That's a super. That can be heard in something like 10 or 12 states. That's a major station. So that was a bit of a coup. But yeah, you're right. You want to talk about your book? Anybody who will listen, there's people out there that are going to probably be interested in what we do, and so it's great to share the word, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing. And you know what I say to people? This is what I tell people. I'm not looking for RBIs, and I'm not looking to hit for average. All I want is a couple of hits, and that's all you really need.
Yep. And maybe sell a couple of books and you and I, neither of us get rich doing this stuff, but we do it because we love it, and we love talking about it. We love researching. What I love doing is finding stuff that no one else has found before and then sharing that, because expanding people's knowledge about baseball, in my case, especially in the early days of the game, I just think that's so exciting, because those days back then was really fascinating, the things that were going on. And I've always found that baseball reflects its times, and it's more than just about the game. It's about the history of people, and it's about the history of society and the trends, and I mentioned earlier the Victorian times in Detroit. They didn't believe that gentlemen would play baseball. That's beneath their dignity. And then we can talk a little bit, if you want, about the Sunday games and the alcohol in the ballpark. And yep. I think Detroit made a mistake joining the National League. They should have joined the other league, because the working people of Detroit needed to have something they could do on Sunday, and yet there was no baseball allowed because of the National League.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm going to be talking about now, and again, it comes directly from one of your books that we had you on the show. We had you on for the Comsters, and we had you on for Pud Galvin. And whenever anyone talks to me about 300-game winners, and I mentioned Pud Galvin, I said, you've got to go buy this book by Chip Martin, because they have no clue who it is. I said, do you realize something that I've never learned before, that if his stats, like you told me on the show, were from the International League, if the extra 50 wins were applied to his win record, he would have over 400 wins.
Yep, he'd be the third winningest pitcher of all time, not the fifth winningest pitcher. Right. But because he spent a couple of years in the International Association, which has not yet been recognized as a major league, those 50-something wins that he accumulated there are not credited to him. And that's a crime, because, quite frankly, the International Association that our team from London was in, and Guelph from Ontario making it the International League, International Association, but major players of the day. I mean, early Fred Goldsmith, Candy Cummings, Galvin, Dutch Horning, a lot of the Russ Barnes, a lot of the real early stars of the games. It was a rival league to the National League. It only lasted 4 years in all. But it should be considered a major league, and people like Galvin should be given credit for that time. It's not like he was playing in a void. He was playing against the best players of the day, with some of the best players of the day. So, anyway, we talked about that before, but that's the sort of thing that you turn up and you go, oh my God, how can that be?
Now, this is where Pud Galvin gets into this discussion, because we're going to talk about Stump Weidman over here. And he was with Buffalo, and again, you mentioned he toiled in the shadow of Pud Galvin. Why was Stump toiling in the shadow of Pud over here, and what was going on with him that he made the trek from Buffalo to Detroit?
Well, there was a well-worn path between Buffalo and Detroit. Now, keep in mind, back then, the easiest way to get from Buffalo to Detroit was by boat. He didn't have to go through, on the railways and have to go on, the rudimentary roads. But there was a well-worn path between Buffalo and Detroit. Now, Pud Galvin was actually taken by Allegheny, which was the Pittsburgh team. When the Buffalo team started having some troubles in 1885, they had a brand-new ballpark, and they couldn't get people coming out, and it was pitiful. The team directors were saying, we've been in the National League here since 1879, and it's now 1885, and we're just not getting the crowds out. We're not making enough money. So they started selling off some of their players. Well, Pud Galvin, the star pitcher, he was Buffalo's first superstar in any sport, was sold off to the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. And then shortly after, the guy from Detroit who replaced Thompson as the owner of the Detroit Wolverines tried to get the Big Four. The Big Four players were Dan Bruthers, Hardy Richardson, Deacon White, and Jack Rowe from Buffalo. They're hitting. They were called the Big Four because they were terrific batters and terrific players. And he tried to buy the Big Four from Detroit. Well, the Detroit from Buffalo. The Buffalo director said, no, we're not going to let you just cherry pick. You want those players, you buy the whole team. So Frederick Stearns, the new owner of Detroit, agreed to buy the entire team. And for a little while, Detroit owned both the Detroit and Buffalo franchises. But there were other players that had gone from Buffalo to Detroit as well. It was reasonably close, fairly easy to get to. Detroit was on the rise, just as Buffalo was on the slide, and you saw people like Stump, and you saw people like the Big Four, and there were others. Another guy named Stearns that sort of went along that same migration route. You know, ball players were sort of transient back in those days, and the National League was still trying to insist that when you sign a contract, you stick with it, but there was still contract jumping going on. So it was the proximity, I think, of those two cities and the needs of the one team wanting to build while the other team was trying to sell off. It sort of worked hand in glove.
And you know something? I'm going to ask one last question because, like I said, I knew we're going to have to get into part two. We'll talk about some of the success of the Wolverines the next time, but I do want to address the whole Sunday and drinking thing. That was a huge issue in the 1800s, well into the 1920s for some cities. Let's talk about Detroit.
Well, Detroit was, as I indicated, they were sort of Victorian. They were very late, relatively late getting to professional baseball because the good city fathers and mothers in Detroit didn't care for baseball. Baseball was played by some characters that were into drinking and womanizing and carrying on and all that sort of thing. So it didn't have a great reputation early on. It wasn't really a business. It hadn't proven itself as a business in the 1870s, and that took a while to happen. Cincinnati was kicked out, and Detroit replaced them in the National League for 1881. And then Cincinnati promptly, with Louisville and some other teams, established the American Association in 1882. It became known as the Beer and Whiskey League because it was the teams were owned by brewers or distillers or people that ran saloons like Chris Vanderhoff in St. Louis. And it was successful, that league, because they allowed alcohol to be sold in the ballpark and also game playing in their parks on Sundays. That league was instantly successful. Those teams made money. National League was still struggling because they had the ban on alcohol and Sunday play. I think the National League was they were Victorians that sort of ran it, and they wanted to clean up the act. They wanted to get gambling out. They wanted to get the bad characters out. They wanted to get the contract jumpers out. They wanted to clean up the game. So they came in with sort of a highly moralistic attitude, and that included no alcohol, no Sunday games. Well, Detroit, was an industrial town. People were working 6 days a week. All they had off would be Sunday for church, and then Sunday in the afternoon for some recreation, which Recreation Park that we mentioned earlier was built to address. However, I think that Detroit was in the wrong league, to be honest. I think had they jumped to the American Association with alcohol in the park and Sunday games, I think they could have been more successful and would have lasted longer. The National League teams for the longest time, well into the 80s, were struggling to be financially successful. Chicago always did fairly well from the beginning, but their teams took a long time to become financially viable. There was a number of teams would fall out and be replaced. And at one point, Detroit, because they were buying all this high talent, and this is probably for our next installment, but it was felt that they needed to be taught a lesson by the National League, and they changed the gate receipts issue, and Detroit threatened to jump to the American Association as a result. Well, they got talked out of it, but I've often thought, had they jumped to the American Association, they might have been more successful, because at the end of the day, it was a financial reason that the plug was pulled on the Wolverines. They couldn't get enough people out because they didn't play Sunday games.
Yeah, and, some great history, something I just learned. And, again, that the coming of Van Johnson and the Western League, he would try to clean up baseball. And I can't even mention without any of this would be possible without Ed Acorn, who wrote the Beer and Whiskey League. I know you used a lot from his book. And
Terrific book.
And Eddie lives about, 15 minutes away from me. He's the editor. He's the sports editor at the Providence News-Journal, and he was on my show with the book, the Beer and Whiskey League. And you know something? His book, your books, fueled a huge interest, not only by me, because, I always said, well, I began my baseball study like the forming of the American League and the baseball war from 1900 to 1903, and then the 4 series, and then you get the whole dead ball era, and I was totally inadequately informed or read up on what came before. And your books and so many others like you really shine a light on a topic that is so important because, again, it takes in Irish history. There's a lot of Irish history here, especially in the late 1800s. The Irish, pretty much dominated baseball. With the coming and the came and the play.
And the German influence too, wanting to have a beer with their sports.
What was his name? Aha in St. Louis.
Yeah, Chris van der Aa. Yeah, he was a German. He still had a very thick accent, and a lot of German people in Cincinnati and in St. Louis. And they wanted to have beer with watching their sports, and those teams were very, very successful in the American Association.
Yep, and, all these things you see, especially with the rule changes that happened in the 1880s, players wearing a mask behind the plate. Now we have a glove rather than having barehanded. All these different, the whole pitching mound and distances.
And the rules changes that were many.
Right, and so the evolution of baseball really should get a complete overview since the 1840s and Doc Adams and Chadwick and all those guys, but we don't learn a lot about that, and unless you're actually interested in something like this. But I think shows like this, and I think books like yours, which are well written, and what I like is factual, and Pud Galvin, the Detroit Wolverines, the Tecumsehs. Now I know so much about them because I read your books.
Thank you for doing that, Ian.
So this is what we're going to do. We'll get you back in May. We'll go through the 1880s. We'll talk about how the progress is coming on your Baltimore book and Brother Matthias. Besides Amazon, Chip, where can we find your book?
Amazon, or just Google the name, the Detroit Wolverines, The Rise and the Wreck of a National League Champion, 1881 to 1888, and you can find it everywhere. Not so much in bookstores, but widely available online and Amazon, and also available in ebook for people who want to save a few dollars. And the publisher is McFarland, and it's my 4th baseball book. And maybe next time we can talk about why the Wolverines failed. That's a fascinating story just in itself.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if we don't get to that, we'll have a 3rd show on it. I have, Gerald Podares, he just won the Seymour Medal. On his Los Angeles Dodger book. I'm on the 8th episode with him on it, and he loves it. We go chapter by chapter, and when he's all done, he's going to splice it all together and throw it on his site.
Well, I love your enthusiasm and your love for the early days of the game, Ian. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun talking to you, and if you want to talk again, I'm more than happy to.
Well, I'm going to send you an email right after I get off the phone with you. But hang on a second.
Thanks, Ian.
We'll talk to you for about a minute after I close out of the show, folks. Had a great time with Chip. Always have a great time with Chip. Got to read his material. Go out, get the book. Baseball started. You want to learn about all these teams and the history of baseball. Chip Martin's a great writer, great researcher. I learned a lot. You'll learn a lot. As always, I am Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Chip, for being on the show.
Thank you, Ian.
And also, hey, in regards to, the network itself, the Company's own radio network, and in the immortal words of one of my heroes, Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.